It may have been Terence McKenna who first popularized the phrase, "If you don't have a plan, you'll become part of somebody else's." Perhaps drawing from the poet William Blake's, "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's." I believe this has become one of the tragic underlying themes of our age. As various pretenses were created to overturn one monarchy after another from the French Revolution onward, and as not only religion but the very conception of a higher power began to be so universally attacked from all sides, we slowly but surely lost our foundations and have thus become unmoored, adrift in an increasingly nihilistic chaos. Science and philosophy is now utterly dominated by reductionist and materialist thinkers, and our popular culture grows more cynical and petty, to the point where it becomes nearly impossible to even envision a type of leadership with lofty vision and purpose, capable of fostering that type of energy and forward inertia inspired by our founding fathers. Our consumerist culture has become so divorced from this type of thinking that we lack the reference points to even conjure up the image of inspired leadership. Decades of a unique brand of confused relativism has become both cause and effect of an era producing planless and systemless men. Politicians and influencers that can now be bought and sold, and who are thus very much part of somebody else's plan. This has happened gradually and subtly enough to escape the notice of many. It's as if we've been taken over by a foreign element so powerful and efficient that it's been able to both obfuscate and reframe its takeover as something positive, progressive. Think for a moment about just how successful this cultural revolution has been. We now have a significant percentage of the population that views electing nationalistic leadership as a potentially harmful or net negative prospect. The idea of leaders that fight for the best interests of their own nations and citizens is now viewed as a bad thing by a subset of Americans. We've become so infused with an ideology benefiting globalist moneyed interests that an entire army of academics and influencers have been ushered into power to dogmatically defend and spread this worldview, to argue in favor of systems and structures that exclusively benefit the profit margins of multinational corporations and international finance, engaging in the most shrewd mental gymnastics to try to portray their financial success as our own, as if adding a few billion in profits to a global corporate entity that employs almost exclusively foreign-born workers somehow improves the lives of the average American. And the sad reality is this: though the arguments may be weak and lacking in foundation, they can still win the day in the most influential circles, being backed by the incentivizing force of financial gain and social promotion. A structure has been created whereby those who refuse to parrot to the party line simply don't progress through the ranks in their given fields. Periods of success and comfort have caused populations to drop their guard time and time again throughout history. It becomes easy to forget that corruption and chaos is the norm, the state of being that nations will always revert to unless they remain constantly vigilant. Needless to say, we haven't remained vigilant. Every man now has his price, and that price has been dropping rapidly for decades, as the number of men willing to sell themselves and their nations in exchange for personal wealth and power reaches levels not seen before in modern history. What's worse, those men with a plan behind the scenes have craftily constructed a new moral framework to provide these compromised men with a defense for their actions. Globalism and humanism are branded with the most lofty labels and verbiage, portrayed as doctrines that seek the best for all humankind, that seek to lift all boats regardless of arbitrary lines drawn on a map. They're enlightened, they're forward-looking, they're the means for paving the way towards a new unipolar utopia in which we all join hands and sing. At the end of the day, this is all manipulative wordplay, a facade to mask the fleecing of workers and creators, and serve the interests of middlemen and parasitic personalities. The ultimate irony is that this brutally effective manipulation causes many of those most harmed by its ideology to not only refrain from opposing it, but to actively cheer it on, hijacking the noble impulses towards morality, justice, and generosity to ultimately serve ideas that end up representing their polar opposites. To better understand globalism, a good analogy here might be the evolution of professional sports. In a prior age, if a man played for the Boston Red Sox, for example, you could be reasonably certain that he had very real ties to the city of Boston. Perhaps he was born and raised there. Perhaps growing up in Boston yourself, you'd have seen him around, perhaps even grown up with him, or his siblings and family. And because of this, you shared something of a cultural bond. When the Boston Red Sox played the New York Yankees, for example, you could cheer your home team, knowing they represented your hometown, its people, its culture, its quirks and eccentricities. There's something very real and visceral about this, something primal. This was our civilized replacement for warring tribes and regions. Bloodless warfare, you might say. There was a great deal of spirit underlying these contests, as the fans felt deeply connected, and often were deeply connected on a genetic and cultural level to their hometown competitors. Statistics prove clearly that the home team has always had a very real advantage across every major sport. The reasons for this should be obvious. It's the spirit and energy in the air, so real it can be felt physically. Athletes can't help but pick up on this. It becomes an incentivizing and motivating force. More often than not, they're able to channel this energy into superior performance. We've lost a great deal of this in our age. Athletes and the teams they play for are now commodities, and money runs the show entirely. A pitcher for the Boston Red Sox may be from Cuba and live in Pittsburgh, having only visited Boston a few times outside of home games. And he may well match wits against a pitcher from the Yankees who grew up in California and has no connection to New York whatsoever, outside of the lucrative contract recently signed. Such changes in sports culture cause players to feel less connected to their teams and their teams' hometowns. The players naturally become more individualistic, prizing their own personal performance a bit more and the team's performance a bit less. After all, it's the former that will determine their likely salary in the future. If offered a contract worth 10% more by a team located on the other side of the nation, most will jump at the chance, as team loyalty is now a quaint relic of a seemingly distant past. One may even be tempted by the prospect of intentionally throwing a game or two for financial gain. After all, if you feel no real or substantive connection to your hometown fans, they're just human beings like any others, why shouldn't it boil down to a numbers game, if you're certain you can get away with the act? A world run like a singular, sprawling business sacrifices spirit and energy for the financial gain of those most devoted to the almighty dollar. Sacrificing the uniqueness and individuality of nations and cultures at the altar of consumerism, we become increasingly drained and exhausted in exchange for a very small clique of men, most of whom are a toxic combination of pettiness and psychopathy, to earn virtually unlimited wealth and enjoy every manner of material pleasure, as nations, peoples, and cultures universally devolve into a singular, undifferentiated mass. Another irony here is that while globalism loves to use catchy slogans like "diversity is our strength," the end result of any truly globalist enterprise is the complete destruction of diversity. No more unique and novel racial and cultural characteristics, no intriguing mystery of foreign lands, no beautiful variety, but rather a brown mass of humanity, looking alike, thinking alike, acting alike, being alike, and all marching to the drumbeat of instant gratification that comes from buying and consuming products and services that are ultimately unfulfilling and that represent mere shadows and echoes of what we really most deeply need and desire. In short, Globalism is the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, painstakingly creating an attractive mask to hide the true aim of destroying every last vestige of Western culture and replacing it with an alternative created by the worst element of the merchant class for the worst element of the merchant class. Through clever use of their deep understanding of psychology and manipulation, they've managed to create a new morality to replace the traditional moral structure they've worked so efficiently to destroy. And in doing so, have subsequently created millions of well-intentioned, useful idiots to assist in their destructive enterprise. By engaging in intensive speech controls, which essentially becomes the same thing as thought control over time, it's possible to shape the very root of culture and essentially determine how this tree will grow. One needn't worry about micromanaging how every resulting branch or leaf takes shape, because these are merely predictable outgrowths of the root of their own design. It's in this manner that an extremely small number of powerful individuals can control entire nations, and then sit back and watch as their citizens unconsciously work to restrict their own freedoms, and help create their own boxes and prisons to further propagate their hidden master's vision, all the while thinking they are doing good works in line with the new moral structure. To beat back this cancer, we first need to clearly recognize it for what it is, and be able to communicate this to others. Terms like equality, diversity, tolerance, and the idea of a world without borders and walls still conjures visions of happiness and harmony in millions of indoctrinated souls, who believe deeply that in fighting for such things, they are fighting for the good and the right, not making the connection that in championing such ideas, they're virtually guaranteeing their children will grow up in a far less safe and healthy and happy environment. To manifest rapid and profound change, these are the people that need to be reached, not the subset who know full well that they're engaging in a power play, but that naive and trusting element unable to see through the facade. There are still millions of good people on that side of the fence, whose only crime is that they're a bit too trusting, or perhaps a bit intellectually lazy, or just haven't bothered to cultivate a deep enough interest in politics and culture to fully grasp the machinations behind the scenes. Virtue signaling can feel great, and the social benefits and careerist benefits it provides in certain circles can be addictive. But at some point we need to stop thinking about ourselves and consider the type of world our actions are creating for future generations. Consider talking to that friend or neighbor or coworker if the opportunity arises, and providing a new perspective they may not have considered before. Not in a sermonizing or condescending manner, but genuinely and with kindness. It's a difficult and thankless task, seeking to counter decades of propaganda and working to unravel one layer of faulty premise stacked upon another. But I've come to strongly believe that it's one of the foremost callings of our era. Failure to reach this group in time will lead to a nightmarish future. Success in changing their opinions has the potential to usher in an age of limitless possibilities. Every action, even the seemingly inconsequential, has ripple effects so sprawling and complex as to be incomprehensible. A discussion or two today may well alter the future in ways we can't imagine. And though they may not be able to trace the exact cause and effect path of these ripple effects, your children or grandchildren will appreciate it.